Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Kenny Knowlton, and it's really sort of special for me to be here today because the first lecture I ever gave was in this room 4 years ago when I was still an ACC student, and now I'm like finishing my undergrad at Southwestern 4 years later, and my last lecture here for sure before I go on to grad school in Oregon. So it's funny to sort of close off where I started, you know. So that person in the picture is not me, just for clarification. That is Che Guevara. And I'm a philosophy and Latin American studies major, but primarily philosophy. That's what I'm going to grad school for. And I'm very aware that certain philosophical terms are very jargony and you know, like I was thinking about it because, you know, to me it's sort of intuitive. And so now when I look at this, it's like, what the hell am I talking about, right? Like, just sort of weird. And I understand. And bear with me because that's sort of just the way academia works in a certain level. But I'll do my best to explain whatever term. And if for whatever reason that's not clear, please let me know at the end. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A or whatever. I'm happy to clarify. Whatever it is. So phenomenology, anything that's like ology comes from the Greek logos, which is commonly interpreted as language, but it also simply means account. So phenomenology is the account of phenomena, the account of experience. And so I sort of amended that a little bit to Phenomeno-logicality because there's a particular sort of logic that I'm going to be talking about, and of political economy. And I say political economy instead of politics or economics, following the sort of Marxist tradition, which is to say politics is never separate from economics, right? It's always political economy, which isn't necessarily only a Marxian thing. That was the same thing with Adam Smith, David Ricardo, all the sort of classical economists. They all sort of abided by that principle. Ego Immutabilis and Mimetic Performativity will be explained. So the purpose of this presentation is to examine the phenomenological implications, that is, the implications of experience, and I mean like bodily experience, right? Sensuous activity. Of Che Guevara's political economic writing. So Che Guevara, right, Cuban revolutionary. Really, what a lot of people focus when they read Che Guevara, when they talk about Che Guevara, is his like guerrilla warfare stuff. And that's really interesting, and there's a lot there. But I'm more interested in after the fact. So I'm more interested in what he wrote about organizing political economy. So not necessarily how to do the revolution, but what you do afterwards, right? How does this theoretical analysis manifest practically in the everyday? So yeah, I'm going to talk about things sort of philosophically, and I mean to say practically. There's a sort of common assumption that philosophy is just pure mental masturbation. A lot of that's true. I don't like to approach it that way. I like to think of it as very practical and relevant. So just sort of keep that in mind. Reading him and seeing the relevance for 21st century socialism and what that means, at the core of my argument is that Che, an innovative and practical revolutionary thinker, was concerned with what I call the mimetic aspect of the social human condition in Latin America, under a colonial matrix of power, and therefore concerned with acts of novelty found within the horizon of what's typically called the colonial difference, and thus informing what socialism in the 21st century really means. So I'm going to first give a sort of historical account in what's called a social metabolic process. Metabolic precisely in the sense of like metabolism, that's social, like sort of social digestion and growth, right? Metabolism comes from a Greek word for growth. Of two logics. The logic of capital and the logic of coloniality. There's a distinction here between colonialism and coloniality. So colonialism is a sort of historical period. Coloniality is the logic that arises as a result of colonialism. The logic which founds the organization and structure of institutions that come from the sort of colonialism, right? Which is still present today, right? That sort of argument is saying that we have not gotten away from that at all, right? Which is sort of premised on racialized and gendered hierarchies, which I'm going to get into. So after I explain that, that's going to allow for the introduction of a category that will reveal the importance of Che's writings and the reality with which he was faced and with which we are all faced right now, the ego immutabilis. What I find important about Che's theories is precisely their concern with practicality, feasibility, and therefore his recognition that capitalist society must transition and not, as is typically argued, start from a blank slate, right? There's no reason to talk about utopia. We got to talk about how to transition, right? In light of this sort of practicality, I'll be able to show how his theories bear an important experiential relevance that must be taken into consideration throughout the transition to socialism. In exploring that, I'm going to sort of argue that he attempted to overcome both the logic of capital and the logic of coloniality, and therefore the ego immutabilis, by means of what I call mimetic performativity, a modality of praxis, and praxis is just a word for practice, practical activity, specific, again, to the colonial difference in Latin America. So, Marx writes, what we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundation, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist societies, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. A lot of discussions on anarchism and Marxism sort of presuppose that we can sort of start from nowhere, and that's really not the case, right? We can't, utopia, of course, means nowhere, and we can't move nowhere from nowhere. We're always from some place, grounded in some sort of historical experience of some kind, right? Which bears relevance to how we move forward. Che's situated horizon, where he's coming from, emerged from a historicity unfolding through this intersection of the logic of capital and the logic of coloniality. In order to make this clear, I'm situating him within a decolonial philosopher's framework, historical framework, Enrique Dussel. And Dussel distinguishes the emancipatory processes of Latin America between two periods. The first was the Creole liberal revolution of independence in the early 19th century, and the second began in 1959 with the Cuban Revolution and is still ongoing. So, the Creole revolutions. Its detachment from European power was incorporated in its epistemic internalization of the logic of coloniality, a matrix already integrated and presupposed in the emancipatory process. Epistemic internalization, epistemology is just a fancy word for knowledge and what constitutes valid knowledge. So that when the Creole elite, right, the sort of elites in Latin America, when they consolidated their power in independence, they did not move away from European epistemology. In other words, all of the sort of institutional structures and the logic by which that operates is grounded in European thinking, right? It is not properly Latin American thinking or anything like that, right? Such that all of the sort of legal codes in every Latin American country is based on the Napoleonic Code from France, right? So, so the detachment is merely formal, not practical, if that makes sense, right? So like formally, they're independent, and there's a sort of history there with like Bolivar in Bolivia, or in Bolivia and Venezuela, that was like, oh, okay, well, we have to be free. Of course, he was talking about specifically white bourgeois males, right, who owned property, right? He was not talking about the indigenous. He was certainly not talking about blacks who were enslaved, and for sure not talking about women, right? So the logic of coloniality is a social metabolic process which is premised on hegemonic principles of Eurocentric philosophy. That is, philosophy centered from Europe, which sort of thinks itself as neutral and as universal. When the European philosopher speaks, he speaks not for himself, he speaks for everybody, and that's sort of presupposed and hidden, sort of mystified in the fancy jargon, right? That forms part of the rhythmic patterns of Latin American thinking. It is Latin America's situated reasoning, political, economic, and juridical, right? So, historically, this logic produced, and I'm quoting here, a colonial matrix of power, which signified, as Mignolo writes, quote, control of the economy, of authority, of gender and sexuality, and of knowledge and subjectivity. That is, end quote, that is, schemas of racialized and gendered and epistemic hierarchies, which form part of the ideological reproduction of the existing social relations, such that they are assumed as natural. They are taken as correct. We sort of assume the naturalness of like a male-female divide, or we assume a natural division in race or whatever, right? That's sort of internalized. This logic, operative since the colonial encounter, was solidified precisely during these Creole revolutions of independence under the auspices of liberal pretexts of freedom, individuality, private property, and economic development, when the Creole elites were able to seize independence from Europe while maintaining hegemony based on European instrumental rationalism. So the detachment, again, was purely formal, and it made sense that the Creole elite sort of identified with it, since it justified the dynamics of power in the social relations already present, and enhanced the continuous manipulation of the body politic in such a way that reproduced, in heterogeneous forms, social antagonisms between the bodies of politics and the bodies that constitute economic production. I really like to emphasize bodies here, right? Because we're not just talking about abstraction, we're talking about real people in the everyday lives, right? So there's, oh, I should have got to this earlier, but there's a lot of literature on this, namely one specific guy who's really good is Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist that complicated Marx's historical analysis of the way that capitalism developed in Latin America. So Marx has this sort of assumption that, oh, capitalism spreads, and then everybody is just suddenly capitalist, and you have to do this transition. Well, Quijano is like, well, yeah, but not really, right? So that specifically in Latin America and other peripheral countries being colonized, what developed was a certain mixture of different economies, right? So like there is the general capitalist economy, but there are also alternate pockets in which capital doesn't operate quite in the way that Marx had predicted, right? So sort of complicates Marx's sort of analysis. So such that different races were tied to different functions within society in accordance with a particular essence, right? So since the indigenous and blacks were considered subhuman, and this is pretty obvious if you read any of these famous philosophers, like, for example, Kant, his whole justification of enlightenment and all that, which we take as, oh, he's talking about everybody. He is sure as hell not talking about everybody, right? He has a very clear distinction in who he's talking about. And so, you know, that's something that needs to be made clear. So that particular functions that are connected to these essences are in accordance with these racialized and gendered hierarchies. So, for example, indigenous, semi-feudal labor. Blacks, okay, slaves, right? And so that there's a sort of racialized ineptitude that is presupposed in European thinking that manifests practically, right? It's not just that they were just thinking about it. This manifests in people having to do a particular sort of work that was predetermined, not by them, but by somebody imposing, right? Which is the point. And it gets even further complicated when racialized and gendered hierarchies are also subject to technological critique. And therefore, a hierarchical conception of the labor process of non-Europeans emerges. So the relationship between the human and his environment reveals the technology used by and relevant to a given group of people in a given environment. If it is established that the most valid relationship with nature, and therefore the technology arising therefrom, and the social relations that emerge at the same time, are of European origin, if that's what the claim is, which for the Europeans it was, then other technologies and other forms of labor processes, other forms of doing labor, other ways of performance, are seen as primitive or unscientific or, in the sort of economic sense, unproductive. It is duly the case if such delegitimized technology and modes of labor do not function instrumentally as a means-end rationality. So racialized and gendered hierarchies become hierarchies of technology, labor, and therefore social praxis. These hierarchies presuppose the devaluation of non-European groups and their manner of interacting with nature, and the semiotic meanings derived therefrom. Again, if this is understood hierarchically, then the technology and production of cultural symbolic meaning of non-Europeans are scrutinized and considered invalid as a result of an essentialized racial ineptitude. So, through his encounter with Lenin, Che was familiar with certain imperialist elements of the rise of capital, but he did not give a nuanced account like this about race and gender hierarchies, right? That just wasn't his thing. He was more familiar, of course, with the logic of capital. So, the logic of capital is the mystified social metabolic process of commodity production, where surplus value and its reproduction is seen as natural law, revealed, of course, in the unplanned market, right? God's invisible hand and whatnot, and its equilibrium, revealing thus a set of social relations oriented around this form of production based on exchange relation between commodities in motion. Very loaded sentence right there. But by social relations, I mean, of course, that there's a certain division between, or arising from the mode of production, right? So that there's like, for example, somebody owns private property, which means they get to designate what happens in that property. So just for clarification, because a lot of this just never really is commented on in Marxist literature. I don't know why. I find this distinction very important. When Marx is talking about private property, he's not talking about your house. He's not talking about your clothes, right? Because people are like, oh, my private property, you're going to take away my stuff. It's not that simple, right? Obviously. The point for Marx is property that entails production for social use, right? So that with private property, you have a designated property that produces stuff, except that the way that that is determined and organized is not democratic. It is contingent upon who owns the property. Therefore, there arises a set of social relations, right? A set of relationships between workers and between owners, between managers, and so on. So at the bottom here, I have some little examples. The whole thing about, so surplus value isn't quite profit, although profit is a part of surplus value. Surplus value entails a little bit more than that. So this first expression at the bottom, MCM1, is money, commodity, and then surplus value. So you get money and a little bit, right? Which is how the capitalist makes money. And the CC plus LL equals TL, it's constant capital plus living labor. So like when I'm producing something in Marx's account, I have to invest in the tools. So for example, let's say I'm the capitalist here, y'all work for me. Well, I go and I invest and I buy tools. That's what Marx calls embodied labor. So let's say we're all making chairs. Okay, well, I'm gonna provide you the equipment that has to already have some labor contained in it for y'all to get together and build the chairs. You building the chairs together would be living labor, which equals the total value of that commodity, is the cost of the equipment and stuff, and your time that you take to build the thing, right? And then, but if that's all equal, I don't make any money. And I can't change the constant capital. What I can do is pay you less than the value you put in the act of working, or in my terms, in your performance, in the performativity. And again, I really like to focus on the sensuousness here. Like, this is activity, right? The system of capital accumulation produces, at one and the same time, an international division of labor and an internal antagonism between laborers, and is configured through this web of social antagonisms from which it is never separate, and in which it begins to mediate a variety of social relations in heterogeneous form. The production and reproduction of surplus value, MCM1, subsumes social tendency and adapts to them. The ontological role of capital is the constant search for surplus value, that is, abstract value. So to go a little bit further in this, each commodity must be both, this is how Marx starts Capital, right? So there's another sort of misunderstanding about Marx a lot of the times. A lot of the times I hear, oh, you know, Marx, communism looks really good on paper, but not in practice. Except that that doesn't exist, right? So Marx never writes about communism or what communism would look like. His whole analysis is about capital and how capitalism works, right? There's no point in his wide variety of works where he writes down, oh, communism looks like this. There's a reason for that. It would be sort of contrary to his philosophical materialisms to do that, right? It has to be more organic and spontaneous than predetermined. That's a different point, which I'm happy to talk about later. So he starts Capital by analyzing commodities, and commodities have to have both a use value and an exchange value. So it has to be useful, right? I can't just produce something that no one's going to use, or it won't do anything, right? And as the exchange value is as it relates to other commodities, right? So it is a social relationship. So exchange value is revealed in one commodity's relation to another in the act of exchange on the market. The reason is that in the act of exchange, under relations of private property, the mystified value of the commodity, because it's hidden from us, itself expresses itself as a price, costs something, right? Which simultaneously reflects the quantifiable living labor required to produce it. Although this is hidden from the immediate experience of a commodity as it appears on the market. When I go to Walmart and I buy something, I don't see the labor processes that got that thing there. That's hidden from me. In other words, the commodity is experienced as an object whose process of production cannot be known through consumption alone. I do not know it through consuming it. Right? That's all hidden from me, which is the famous commodity fetishism, right? So the logic of capital is thus a sequence of determination of value. It is a movement where money becomes capital, because money is not quite capital, once it subsumes human labor, and capital is that which infiltrates and mediates relations around production and seeks to valorize itself. The caveat here is that labor power, so like the working power, a worker's power, which is like somebody commodified, right? When you're a worker, you are objectified. You are a commodity that produces value, right? That's why people don't give a shit if they fire you. So that human relations are, I'm sorry, let me go back. The caveat here is that labor power, the actual potential of the performance of labor, is also commodified and therefore exploited, so that human relations are transformed into a relation between alienated and antagonistic individuals competing on the market. When we're looking for jobs, we're competing against each other, right? Quote, thus, the character of existing relations among workers may itself emerge as a barrier to the workers' drive for self-development, end quote. The objectified living labor produces value, which the capitalist secures as the juridical, that is legal, owner of the result of the laborer's performance. For the value added by labor is hidden in the completion of the commodity form. So important here is the performance of labor itself, which is based on the material acquisition of money, since it is precisely for money and by money that the laborer is able to reproduce his or herself. The laborer sells their labor power, which produces and is reproduced as a commodity. The wage, in fact, mystifies the difference between the time spent to acquire the means of subsistence, in other words, the time I need to work to keep surviving, to pay rent, to go to the grocery store, etc., and the surplus labor, that is the labor I give to the capitalist, that the capitalist sort of takes from me and takes an advantage of in this process. So one must perform within the structure and logic of capital in order to survive, right? And that's like formally understood as socially necessary labor time. Let me see if I have, so it's sort of maybe surmised that the performativity of labor has value under a determinate mode of production. It's not that labor has value just in general. Labor has value under particular forms of production, where labor power is commodified and subject to the socially necessary labor time, and then also the production of surplus value, right? So that's the general totalizing function of capital. That's how it operates in general. The laborer produces surplus value in order to maintain his existence so that he works for a wage, and then they're alienated from each other, which gets really complicated once you incorporate race and gender into the picture, right? But this general ontological rule has ontic effects, and by that I mean particular effects. And this is because of the uneven and combined development of capitalism. Different laborers in different elements of the production process have different needs. The ontological role of capital, therefore, has particular effects in relation to positionality of each laborer as racialized and gendered laborers, constantly competing against each other, despite suffering similar effects of alienation and estrangement. This is class struggle and class antagonism, like as such, right? So that this logic results in a dynamic web of social relations that are materialized and condensed in the logic of the structures that orient themselves toward this form of production, and is always already intertwined with the logic of coloniality. They are never separate from each other. A really clear example of this is like the police, but we can get into that later. So that these two logics inform one another in their metabolic growth. They become embedded in the production and reproduction of structural relations, both in politics and economics, right, in the state and outside of it, by digesting labor power and the mechanisms of social reproduction and excreting surplus value and bourgeois ideology, while at the same time creating the labor's dependency, right, because we have to have money to keep existing. So to demonstrate the significance of Che's writings, I propose a term that encompasses both the logic of coloniality and the logic of capital that I just explained, the ego immutabilis. Ego immutabilis is just Latin for the immutable ego. So epistemology, again, is knowledge. So this is a framework of what constitutes the production of valid knowledge, which in the Eurocentric sense historically presupposes that there is an essence tied to a particular category, right? So i.e. male, rational, female, irrational, white, human, non-white, subhuman, market, freedom, science, truth, etc. It underlies both this logic of capital and coloniality, and that is the coloniality of being, as we exist, through this sort of instrumental rationalism, causal, logical, right? And it's part and parcel, as I explained slightly before, to biopolitical economic dimensions that have tied race and gender with particular functions in the historical formation of Latin America, as elsewhere, but my focus is primarily Latin America. Ideologically conditioning performances that literally, the way we behave, presupposing that they are natural performances tied to particular categories, right? Like very present today when some conservative tells you that the woman's place is to be in the kitchen. Right? Not much different. So this type of thinking is, again, the assumed naturalness of the logic of everyday life, which presupposes immutability. It presupposes that you cannot change and that change doesn't happen. Presupposes static identities and ignores the complexity behind the existing social relations through which we are all operative. So this type of thinking is a result of an ontology. Ontology is just the study of being, of substance, and underlies the production of knowledge and their principles that permeate political economic thinking. Kant, for example, develops a teleological justification that connects a racial category's essence to its full potential. So for him, only white men could achieve enlightenment, right? And he has this whole thing on like Adam and Eve and how each race is a different seed and each seed contains these potentials. It's like, what? But that is very much present, for example, in the logic of science. As a matter of fact, Kant is responsible for the transition from Christianity historically as the sort of place from which truth is determined to then scientific objectivity and to way science determines truth. It's sort of ironic, right? Because, like, for example, just full disclosure, I'm an atheist, which is not to say that I don't support religious groups. I very much do. But when I was sort of immature about it, younger, there's like, oh, you want to talk shit and like, debate or whatever, right? Little did I know that precisely the logic that I was engaging was no different. And once you start looking at that, it becomes really weird to see the connection between, for example, science and Christianity in the way that they determine truth. Second, Hayek, a neoclassical economist, and who pretty much set up the world that we live in right now. He was like really operative in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Everything that is considered neoliberal originates from his sort of thinking. Religiously defends the essential, right, the presupposed essence of the justice of the market. Orthodox Marxists also assume a linear essence in the transition to socialism. Heteronormativity assume binary divisions between the rational male and the irrational female. So such assumptions of determinacy assume the impossibility of the permutation or mutability of category and categories, overlooking thus their fluctuations and malleable articulations in everyday life. That is, the determination of a category's essential purpose necessarily excludes one's agency, that is, one's potential of creating novel acts through novel uses of the body. That operate between the lines of essentialized conceptions. Novel acts which don't fit neatly, right, within the predetermined categories. So the rationalism of European philosophy in general is embedded in binary dualisms, distinctions that divide the political and the economic, the good from the bad, the civil from the barbarous, which is like what colonialism is based on, right? The assumption that the indigenous are barbarous, therefore we should either convert or kill them. The male from the female, the white from the non-white, and so on. Historically, this ideologically conditions performances, right? Like, for example, wage labor, what it means to be civil, heteronormativity, and so on, right? So to put simply, what I call the ego Immutabilis expresses the intersection, again, of the logics of capital and coloniality, and their unfolding in the historical development of Latin America, resulting in, quote, a set of configurations, assemblages, or bundles of social relations and processes oriented around the systemic reproduction of the capital relation, but not reducible either historically or logically to that relation alone. In other words, what Marx got wrong is that it's not merely about economics. It's also about how race and gender sort of operate within the political-economic realm. So through this sort of framework, right, in the same way that the self-valorizing logic of capital abstracts from communal being, that is, from social being, individualizing purpose, so too does the logic of coloniality abstract human activity by rationalizing activities through the framework of racialized and gendered essences. Therefore, logic of capital and coloniality possess these sort of interrelated moments. So through the framework of the ego immutabilis, we can suggest that people are considered a kind of thing, objectified thing, a racialized and gendered performer, a commodity that produces other commodities, and that such performative expression is always already predetermined by one's position within the hierarchy of capitalist and colonial relations. So, you know, and that's really how the economy works as well. Production is for the sake of surplus value, not for, like, sustenance, for example. These essentialist determinations of performance are naturalized and is the assumed epistemic starting point in the evaluation of society. And as part of the logic from which thinking emerges, we are grounded in these historical presuppositions that we take as natural, that give to us as natural, right? In other words, ego immutabilis, in my argument, is the background of perception in general. In other words, a thinking from. This is where we think from, which is to say that all performance is initially perceived under the fixity entailed in this sort of notion. Civility, heteronormativity, the way we approach work, are all approached from the assumption of these social identities, their essential characteristics, and therefore their performances and presupposed dualisms, which I don't think exist. Again, this is manifest most concretely in the rhythm of everyday life. The ideology flows into the dwelling, the social nexus, in the sites of social praxis, of social practical activity. It conditions and habituates performances in social spaces, right? I go into a bar, I don't have to think about what's going on, right? Things are sort of presupposed. In the sites of production, that is like work, conditions the purposes, methods, and organization of production, and thus the performance of labor. This ideological conditioning and these patterns of activities are inseparable from the conditioned logic of the state and its apparatuses, configured as a spatial but material ideological force with internal fissures and breaks, and not simply reducible to a monolithic, immutable block. So, it's important to recall that Marx writes, quote, "Whatever the social form of the production process, it has to be continuous. It must periodically repeat the same phases. A society can no more cease to produce than it can cease to consume. When viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, and in the constant flux of its incessant renewal, every social process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction." So that production is a priori assumed, right? These social relations, and in my argument, the ego immutabilis, that this naturalizing process, again, grounds production in consciousness as bourgeois consciousness, as individualistic Cartesian consciousness, as precisely the consciousness of the immutable ego. So the novel, we're not quite there yet. The novel, that which exposes this framework, the immutable ego's abstractions and tensions, is necessarily thus unsettling. The embodied ego immutabilis, it makes sense, paints a simple picture of causal connections. Any interruption of its sensibility is deserving of skepticism. Hence the importance of attending to transitions in political economy in order to develop a decolonial critical perspective. Thus, Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, Dussel had two categories for the emancipatory process. The first is the revolutions of independence. The second begins in 1959, according to him, with the Cuban Revolution, and is still ongoing. So Che was concerned with developing a transitional mode of production. That is, with an economic system that attempts to A, undermine the law of value operative in capitalism, and B, construct a new subjectivity, a new way of performing and thinking about things, right? He emphasized that alterations of the economic mode of production must include conditions for the construction of new identities, a new consciousness. Quote, "A socialist economy without communist moral values does not interest me. We fight poverty, but we also fight alienation. If communism neglects facts of consciousness, if it focuses merely on production, it can serve as a method of distribution, but it will no longer express revolutionary values." So he was particularly critical of the USSR, because the USSR, although they claim to be communist, right, were not. I mean, the most obvious, right, is that at the core, socialism just means that workers control the means of production. In other words, if we all worked at the same place right now, there would not really be hierarchies. There would be different functions, but we could co-determine how that's organized and how we distribute the result, right? In the USSR, as in the many other countries of existing, what they call the real existing socialism of the 20th century, had absolutely nothing to do with that, right? It was a state bureaucracy that never overcame the hierarchy that capitalism also has. Economic organization, again, must not merely be concerned with production, but instead concerned with production in such a way that it produces a new social consciousness, a new revolutionary subjectivity, whereby the performance of labor itself contains in its pattern of activities and systems of internal behavior within sites of production a social, communal awareness and concern. Quote, "In our view, communism is a phenomenon of consciousness and not solely a phenomenon of production." In other words, awareness of the social relations signifies the organization of production that concerns itself with their differences and consequences, namely unequal hierarchies and their manifestation in the present. So overcoming the orthodoxy, orthodox comes from two Greek words, orthodoxia. Ortho means proper, doxia means belief, so like proper belief. The orthodoxy present in many a Marxist, overcoming that, Che was aware that centralization of production, done on the basis of the construction of a new identity and not merely for economic sake, must consider the effects of production on the social relations, and that activities performed outside of wage labor, right, outside of sites of production, because again, we're incorporating the social with production, right, not seeing them as separate, as does capitalism, must be integrated into the organization of production itself. So, let me see here. For Che, the capitalist market functions on the basis of the law of value. And that's not just for Che, actually. That's for a lot of people. The law of value is expressed in the sphere of distribution. So, for example, the market. As different commodities are produced and consumed, a type of information is revealed, right? That's how production is organized. One which informs the further production of the commodities in question. That is, the demand of a particular commodity within a particular geopolitical space theoretically informs the production, right? The supply in the sort of classical economic terms. The problem, the obvious one, is that capitalist economic theory begins, quote, its analysis of the economy by certain mental and physical aspects of individuals, end quote, assuming that it is a natural human condition to, quote, behave calculatively, i.e., their behavior conforms to their axioms of choice. I mean, psychology has sort of destroyed this argument years ago, but like formal economics is completely based on this, and it's really weird. The implication here is the assumption that individuals, as if that existed anyway, make their choices independent from their social relations and their reproduction, as if to suggest that a consumer's rationale is independent of their historical material foundations and categorical position in the general picture of social relatedness. This assumption is an essential aspect of the immutable ego, as I have described, and this theoretical premise alone reveals the particular effects between wage laborers who are competing on the market for their own material reproduction, and bases itself again on the assumed fixity of identity and purpose. The law of value, again, is based on exchange value and not use value. It's concerned with exchange and not usefulness, such that commodity production does not entail the satisfaction of needs, which would, theoretically allow for the production and reproduction of human life, but rather production that satisfies the perpetuation of surplus value, and therefore the divisionary social relations that result therefrom. So the Soviets maintained that the law of value is controlled during socialism and can only be overcome once communism is reached. Che, being the practical guy that he is, sought to refute this claim. For him, transitional political economy might have to deal with the law of value at first, but it mustn't operate on the premise of its continued existence. Instead, transitory periods must already begin a reflection on moving away from this law of value as that which guides the process of production. So, basically, Che's attempt to transition to socialism was premised on the integration of the sphere of distribution, the market, and the sphere of production, right? And we can say that these spheres actually do participate with each other, even though capitalist economic theory says otherwise. Production, again, is the actual production of commodities, whereas distribution presupposes the existence of the commodity in its final form and is the sphere in which the commodity is acquired by people interacting on the market. Therefore, distribution relations are determined by production relations. They change when the relations of production change. In other words, by changing the organization of production and thereby changing the relations of production, the law of value begins to be modified to new relations of distribution. The integration of the two spheres thus allows for a gradual integration of social praxis into the process of production by unmasking the presumed distinction between consumer/worker independent from their actual concrete conditions. So, consistent with the law of value, transitional political economy must retain the knowledge of market forces as operational social activities through supply and demand. Such market activities under a transitory mode must at once retain commensurability with socially necessary labor time, as expressed in the price relation between commodities, but which is again under transition. In other words, determining its production under a process of centralization concerned with use value. In other words, making things because they're useful to people. The satisfaction of needs and not capital self-valorization. This is Che's essential point, a socially rational plan which fosters the production of a performance or a type of performance that alters consciousness is fundamental, because in the core of this philosophy here is that we don't change our thinking by thinking about thinking. That's just not how it works. We change thinking by engaging in activities. The activities change our thinking, right? There's no mind-body dualism here. So, to quote Che, the law of value must be eliminated, not by decree, we can't simply just say that it's gone, but through a process of gradual withering away as we develop the new forms inherent to the systems we are building. So, again, Che had to approach theory not as merely a philosophical mental masturbation, but as a practical necessity in the face of a complex situation, one of U.S. imperialism and the possibility of counter-revolution, right? They just had engaged in revolution. Being concerned with practicality and acknowledging existing social relations and existing mechanisms found in the mode of production, Che put forth an economic management system, the BFS, budgetary finance system, that attempted to reorganize political economy. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. One of the things that we can't evaluate the success or lack thereof of this plan is that at the time, Che was debating with a bunch of other Cubans, well, I guess he wasn't Cuban, but with other Cubans present, and the sort of dominant argument was that no, we shouldn't do this, we should follow the Soviet Union's plan. And so that his stuff was only incorporated very temporarily and only in few spaces, right? So again, centralization. For him, it bypasses commodity exchange since there's no transfer of ownership. If you don't own the property, you're not exchanging the property in the same sort of capitalist sense. In other words, we're moving away from the production of surplus value and moving towards surplus labor. But he was practical, right? And he was like, well, he looked at a bunch of capitalist enterprises that were present in Cuba, and he was like, holy shit, they're really efficient. The way that they organize their accounting is really functional and useful. In other words, we can use that and not use it for the same purpose or for the same reasons, right? Which makes a significant difference. Some of the other key things about the BFS are the salary scales. In other words, if you're in a bureaucratic position, like a manager, because that's still a little bit necessary, right? You would have to, you could not make, for example, 2 times more than the laborer, than the most bottom laborer. And he had a focus on moral incentives. So like, for example, anybody in bureaucratic positions, he would make them at least twice a week work at the most lower level work in whatever place. And had a bunch of moral incentives for social participation. Again, he was adamant about creating new categories, right? And his argument is like Marx, as great as he is, only analyzes capitalist society. He doesn't analyze anything, as I said before, about communist society, nor does he analyze how to transition from capitalist society. So to put it bluntly, I guess, new categories signify new approaches to labor, and thereby enabling the possibility of what I call mimetic performativity. So there's more here. I'm not going to go into it about centralization and what that means. If you all want to ask questions later, I'm happy to talk about it. Start getting to the point. By changing the categories of evaluation and organization of the economy, Che sets up a new structure, a new approach in the measurement of, for example, success. Success is no longer correlated with capital accumulation, but rather is measured by the development of democratic relations of production. In other words, for him, it was a successful factory, for example, was one that not only produced things usefully and sort of reduced their own costs by democratic participation, and also measured the extent to which a factory or whatever place or restaurant, etc., performs democratically and allows their workers to participate in the decision-making process. That's how he viewed success. So in that way, Che begins to open the door for encompassing social praxis, the way we interact in general. So for example, that which is taken away from us the moment we clock in somewhere. We don't get to just bring in and operate the way we want, right? There's rules and so on. So I would like to note that he was well aware, again, that consciousness could only change through performance, within structures bearing novel purposes and functions. For consciousness is not altered in theory, but rather in the body's praxis, the practical activities, under conditions that reveal the tensions being overcome. In recognizing that capitalism is the point from which transition occurs, he interestingly noted that certain mechanisms of capitalist organizations could be useful, right? And that this incorporation of the existing state of things and its manipulation for novel purposes is Che's mimetic quality. So again, mimesis is mirroring, but not merely mirroring. It's the ability to produce something novel, right? Which is like how language works, right? So like when you grow up as a child, you're mirroring when you're languaging, right? You're learning words and so on, but you're able to produce new sentences, right? That's an example, right, of mimesis. And in that sense, Che's thoughts assume the fluidity of social relations, right? The fluidity of identity, therefore overcoming the rigid assumptions of fixity and identity. So his ability to incorporate what exists and produce novelty from it is the reevaluation of functions of political economic categories in light of new considerations. For example, producing stuff so that we can sustain ourselves instead of for capital. And therefore, it's a different epistemic starting point. It's a different way to constitute what is valid and important or relevant forms of knowledge, right? So mimesis is a modality of practice, a mode of practical activity. Lefebvre, a French philosopher, writes, quote, "We ascribe to mimesis all activity that proceeds according to a form, and that moreover adds to its form. Thus," he continues, quote, "mimesis is not reducible to imitative repetition. We cannot separate mimesis from praxis and poiesis." Poiesis would be like productive activity, so like the way the economy is organized. And must keep in mind the uneven, obstacle-ridden, and conflictual character of becoming. So in the context of labor, mimetic performativity, as I define it, is a matter of integrating pre-existing relations, because of course, I'm talking about transition, right? We're not escaping that which exists, yet allowing for the production of novelty simultaneously. So at the same time, in his attempt to mitigate the law of value by synthesizing the sphere of distribution, the sphere of production, Che enables the worker to incorporate his social praxis into production, right? A huge difference, specifically in any other so-claimed socialist society, right? So that there's potential here in going beyond merely what Marxists call the development of productive forces, through allowing the worker to bring his social epistemic praxis from distribution, in which he already participates, because he does not participate it merely as worker, right? Always as also indigenous, black, male, female, marginalized, so on, right? Into the participation of novel structures of production that are, again, concerned with the affirmation of the community. Their identities, instead of possessing fixed characteristics, are critical, lived perspectives that allow them to participate in production in creative ways that yield the possibility of transitioning, right, precisely towards socialism. So my larger claim is that social praxis must be included in the process of production. That's how the hell we could possibly get out of the situation we're in. As an epistemic vantage point, right, a vantage point that legitimizes your subjective way of thinking, that allows for this sort of creative performativity, a novelty, the unsettling of the presupposed structures. And two, as a position of, again, practical validity that experiences, the market or the sphere of distribution as premised on antagonistic relations of private property, and therefore, of course, as social hierarchies with implicit and explicit dynamics of power, so that the worker's practical knowledge is the starting point of knowledge for socialist economy. Positionality as social relatedness in general is revealed in the process of production as social relatedness in particular, right? To engender the social, the communal, praxis must meet production through a new form of performance that both emulates what exists, in other words, what is assumed, and creates novelty from it. The process of transition is therefore cemented on the capacity to reveal in the multifaceted horizon the sensibility in grasping precisely this colonial difference that I've been talking about, in exposing the ideological tensions between the consciousness from which thinking emerges, that is embedded in the configuration of the two logics I mentioned before, and the awareness of one's participation through performance in the formation of a novel mimetic act. This sort of awareness, again, has to be embodied, right? It cannot be merely theoretical. And it's open precisely through this sort of revolutionary purpose, a conditions for transitional performativity. In other words, a structure that reveals to those performing in it that the colonial matrix of power has resulted in their exclusion, in their devaluation as human beings, considered only as labor power, right? Whose unique potential of becoming is abstracted in the category of worker that works for the value appropriated, right? So Marx, in Critique of the Gotha program, clarifies, quote, right, by its very nature, can consist only in the application of an equal standard. But unequal individuals, and they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable only by an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, are taken from one definite side only, for instance, regarded only as workers and nothing more is seen in them, everything else being ignored. Che's whole point completely overcomes this problem. Quote, I think the place to start, and I'm quoting Che, is to recognize the individual's quality of incompleteness, of being an unfinished product. The vestiges of the past are brought into the present in one's consciousness, and a continual labor is necessary to overcome them. So the mystification of the two logics' unfolding contradictions is uncovered to the performer at the site of production praxis, the moment at which the site itself, the place, and I mean like actual space we're in, means inclusion, means agential power. The moment that the site, the produced space, because space is always produced, allows for the creation of new habits, new processes of embodying different sets of activities, a mimetic performance, right? A performance of precisely being in between the old and the new. And to be that kind of being, that is human being, is to produce above and beyond mere self-reproduction, to be a transformative mediating agency in the natural world, to be the creative source of immense novelty. The human being envisions relevance in the world and adds it to the world produced. Navigating between the dialectical contradictions, this mimetic performativity is precisely an embodied experience and therefore bears the potential of a change in perception. From a thinking on the basis of the immutable ego that still remains embodied to a thinking in between borders, in between limits, in between the old and the new, a transitional form of thinking. So, the extent to which the relations of productions are evaluated from historically and socially relevant categories, ones that reveal positionality in the transition process, is the extent to which the colonial difference can be revealed to condition mimetic performativity. This is why, as Fanon reminds us, Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. So, a Chicana feminist, Gloria Anzaldúa, has a sort of concept called border thinking. And that's an aesthetic praxis that situates itself precisely between these contradictory and antagonistic histories, affirming identity in novel praxis. In La Frontera, the history emerges, in other words, the denied history, the history of subjugation, exclusion, and at once the confrontation between the images that make the real are distorted. Don't need to go into that too much. And that's essentially the point. The transitional mode of production must allow for the aesthetic component that is, again, rooted within subaltern and marginalized groups. So Marxism meets decoloniality right there, at the exposition of social relations, of the different relationships between mutable categories, each permutation situated in its peculiar historicity, but retaining the expression of the structural whole as a part of its contradictory unfolding, again, through the logics of coloniality and capital. So, again, there are some problems, right, with Che. Che doesn't account for this, and doesn't account for mimetic performativity at all, and doesn't really account for the difference between the labor as woman, as indigenous, as racialized, and so on. So the construction of identity, again, which is a performance, because identity is performance. We perform our identity, and it's not unique to us because our identities are also perceived by other people, regardless of our performance, and sometimes because of our performance, is relevant in the extent to which the position of this identity reveals its part in the structure of social relations in general. So that we have to take that very seriously, right? The acknowledgement of positionality of identity within the labor process, within production, within politics, is mimetic performativity. Once identity is placed within economic production as part of its material conditions, which neoclassical economics does not do in any way, shape, or form. Anybody who's read any economic textbook would be very aware of that. The revelation of positionality of identity that is expressed under hierarchical existing relations, and therefore sees identity as constitutive of a historical social formation that includes deferring approaches to things, deferring approaches to production, opens the possibility of materializing the affirmation of the value of human life that have been hitherto negated, denied, or dismissed as lesser, as non-Western, and thus as irrational or inefficient. That's it. So, questions? Mm-hmm.
What made you, I guess what made you make your presentation? What expanded your ideas on this?
It was in like trying to understand Marx and Marxism and decolonial philosophy and how decolonialism applies to that. And so I saw a lot of flaws in Marx and a lot of flaws in my study of the Soviet Union. So I was really interested in the way that the Soviet Union organized their economy, because of course, there's a lot of critiques, right, obviously. And so I wanted to understand why they couldn't fully escape these dynamics of hierarchies. And that's how it sort of led to, because most of Marxism doesn't really take into account body and performance, right? They sort of talk about economics and like sort of overlook experience, right?
Have you studied like Cuba's government?
Yeah, that was basically the budgetary finance system, and the problem there is that Cuban government didn't take what Che did and did precisely just sort of reproduced what the Soviet Union wanted them to, right? A symptom. Not necessarily some sort of problem of Cuba in itself, but rather a result of like Cold War dynamics and, also U.S. foreign policy and so on, right? Any more questions?
Why do you think socialism is such a taboo subject? And also, why do you think that we as a society are so reluctant to stray away from capitalism in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I think in the U.S. specifically, probably largely due to the Red Scare and post-1945 and the relationship with the Soviet Union, which is why so many people, I think, are just scared to even talk about it. And mostly because people have absolutely no idea what it means, right? So most people that I talk to, so I have a red shirt that has a big-ass hammer and sickle on it, and I was sitting at a coffee shop, and I don't really think much of it, right, just a shirt. And this dude walked in and saw me, and he was like, "What the hell are you wearing? What does that mean? Do you know what that means?" I was like, Jesus. I was like, sit down. We had a conversation, and it was much better. But right, they already approach it super negatively, and I think that we're so embedded in individualism, and that's sort of my whole point. Is sort of it's embodied, right? We sort of presuppose the way we behave on the assumption that we are individuals and that we act independently from one another and so on. So and it's also scary right? It's scary and I understand that argument. It's scary to think of organizing society in a different way, because that also means a significant amount of responsibility. Specifically socialism or communism in general, that signifies a completely different approach of interacting with one another. And that's, it's tense, right? It's not easy. Oh, yeah. So what Kant did, Kant's pretty much the one responsible for Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinking. And there's several essays. So like there's one called On the Use of Teleology in Nature. And teleology is just that, something from its essence has some sort of end, right? So like from when I'm born, my teleological purpose is to be Y, right? And he's very much thinking of that. And so like that and in Perpetual Peace is another piece. And all this stuff's probably online for free somewhere. But you got to be careful with translations. They're very different. He sort of constructs a universalism. So for him, it's the categorical imperative. So like, for example, truth, something is true all the time, everywhere. And he's drawing upon some weird stuff. That's why Marx is so important. But in this Perpetual Peace, he sort of, this concept of truth, which he gets from Christianity, and not Christianity proper, because it's not necessarily that all Christians think like this, more Christianity as it manifests politically. So Christendom is sort of where he's coming from, as a way to justify things, and so that the determining of what is true as universal, as opposed to truth being fluctuating. And so he played a huge role in how scientific thinking, because of course at the time, there's no distinction between like philosophy and science, right? At the time, a philosopher was a scientist. And he played a huge role in how that sort of manifested because of his definition of what objectivity meant. And so a lot of other thinkers sort of picked up on that and just sort of continued. The big thing there is like, the critique, of course, is that scientism, right? So it's not blaming science, right? There's nothing wrong with science. There's one thing that's sort of problematic, is that a lot of scientists presuppose that their knowledge is separate from the political-economic relations, right? They sort of don't see how science is subsumed within political economy and never separate from it. The sort of bigger claims is that like the models with which we evaluate and judge nature are not from nature itself, but rather models that we impose on nature to understand nature. In other words, nature is objectified, viewed or presupposed as if nature is something we're separate from. For further, if anybody's interested, there's a thinker called Heidegger, and he writes a lot precisely about this sort of distinction. Namely in a book called Pathmarks.
Do you think, going back to the Soviet Union and how they organized their economy, do you think part of the reason that they couldn't organize their economy in a proper socialist model was because of their history as an empire, as a Russian empire?
I'm sure that had influences with it. And it's really weird, right? Because, so like, if you read Lenin up until the revolution itself, he seems like a total anarchist, right? In some points, like he wants everyone to like sort of do their thing. But as soon as they took power, and again, Soviet is just a Russian word for council. That's all it was. So like, all power to the Soviets just meant all power to workers' councils, which was actually doing really well. But as soon as he got in power, so different people argue different things, but I think for the most part, it's safe to say that he sort of abolished them on the premise that he had to consolidate power quickly. So he was trying to just be practical. And in that, right, he died very soon afterwards, and Stalin came, and the rest is history, I guess. Anything else? No? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I guess it was asked the question, why? So in school, I was taught that the USSR fell apart because capitalism is better.
Of course.
But how did it actually fall apart?
I mean, there were a lot of internal dichotomies, right? A lot of external pressure. There's so much. One of the argument from most contemporary Marxian economists is that their form of production never escaped state capitalism. So like this thing with, like I was talking about the law of value and stuff, well, they never moved away from the law of value. They always, their production was very much organized in the same way capital is, just that they had different terms for it. So, I mean, I think it's a confluence of things. It's like a lot. One of the things is mainly, what's his name? Gorbachev. I mean, he was pretty explicit about his role in dismantling the Soviet Union, for sure. He was not hiding that in any way. One of his main intentions, right? Yeah, because, like, this sort of bureaucratic and hierarchical control sort of did exactly what capitalism does in different ways. It abstracted taking the worker's position seriously, right? And so, like, you have this sort of small group of state bureaucrats that think they know everything, and, right, they definitely didn't.
Why do we keep calling these different states communist states if they're not actually communist?
Well, it's really weird that that's the case. I think just propaganda and like just the way people want to use the term, because you could not, in what is defined as communism, there wouldn't be a state, right? That wouldn't. It would be like saying I'm a Catholic atheist. It just doesn't make much sense. You know what I'm saying? You can't have a government and have communism, because communism would be the lack thereof. Right, so it's sort of weird. I mean, if you want to get really into it, there's a guy named George Kennan who's like sort of the head of U.S. foreign policy in post World War II. Like, he's pretty much the guy that outlined how the U.S. operated in regarding foreign relations, and it's called Memorandum PP 23. And he says, and I'm quoting like directly, that we have, he's talking about the United States, and he says we have 6% of the world's population, but over 50% of the world's wealth, and we have to do everything in our power to maintain this disparity, putting aside vague and idealized notions such as human rights, raising of the living standards, and democracy. Preferring military intervention when possible to secure our interests and needs, and protect ourselves from so-called communists. And even he himself says in the same paragraph, the latter term, referring to communism or communists, has lost any substantive meaning in U.S. political rhetoric and simply refers to anybody who stands in our way. And that was from 1947. It hasn't changed much, right? George Kennan. And he wasn't an academician, right? He was like in the State Department, right? The like U.S. foreign policy guy.
So you say communism would essentially, its true form, be a lack of government. I guess that could be true of other forms of government like democracy. True democracy
I think both, actually. I think both. Yeah, I mean, the key issue for Marxists, right, is that and this is like the critique on liberalism, is that you have this sort of formal democracy in politics. So like, okay, we can all go and vote. But for like communists, the idea is to have democracy in the workplace. In other words, we are not really democratic until the way we labor is decided by ourselves in communion, right? And there's like pockets where that exists, right? Like there's cooperatives and you know, things like that, but not the predominant form, right? We don't go to work thinking like, hey, I get to like decide when I go to work this week. You know, sometimes maybe you have a really nice manager or something, right? But not typically. And this is actually back to like what's called the early Marx. So the word for truth in Greek is aletheia, which means that which is wrested from hiddenness, wrested with a W, like that which reveals itself, which means that it's in flux. And so, for example, this is where philosophy gets really weird, because like you're like talking about the chair, and what does the chair mean? Well, actually, sometimes that has actual practical relevance, right? So, like for example, for Kant, Descartes, and Hayek, and most of what's called idealists, like what capitalism is based on, they sort of see truth as immutable, as we mentioned before. So I know the truth of that chair by thinking about it. For Marx, going back to the Greeks, that couldn't be further from the truth. I know the truth through praxis. I know the truth of the chair in my interaction with it, because in my interaction with it, the truth of it reveals itself to me, right? Which is where he gets this distinction between like managers and laborers. This is his whole premise of like why laborers should control the means of production, because laborers are the one doing the practical activity. In other words, they're the ones in the revelation of truth in action, whereas like the capitalist or the manager, right, is sort of theoretically designating what goes on, not participating in the actual revelation of truth of a certain type of activity.
Well, what do you mean by the truth of the chair relevance to that? Like, could the truth to me be that that chair is a desk to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the point. You know, and I mean, that gets a little more outside of political economy and more into like perception and perception. But yeah, one of the things, the reason you don't see it as a desk because, or you can, in other words, if you're sitting on the floor because you didn't want to sit in the chair, you can put your water bottle on the chair and it's like a nightstand. You know what I'm saying? And that is sort of related to like the function and its function, and so that we would typically not see it as a desk because socially in this sort of produced space, it's implied that it's a chair, right? And that's the function of that thing.
Is that why you said that Marx never defined communism?
Yeah, exactly. Organically determined. There's debate there amongst a lot of Marxists. So like, this is why I never suggest for people to read the Communist Manifesto. And it's weird because most professors start with the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto is something I really don't like because it's like it really was just a political propaganda piece, and he was just trying to get people riled up. It's not like a theoretical investigation into what it means, right? And in the Communist Manifesto, he's very deterministic, and you know, that typically shows a lot of problems regarding like how he actually thought the development of communism would work, which once he started studying agrarian labors in Russia, that changed drastically. In his letters to different thinkers, he was like, yeah, I was definitely wrong about the way like communism may develop, but it can and inevitably would develop organically, spontaneously, and therefore differently in different geopolitical spaces. Right? He doesn't use those words, but that's basically the core of what he was saying. Damn. That's a good question. I would start with the, so this is tricky because like I started reading Marx when I was like 14, and that was like 14 years ago, and I didn't really get the core of what the hell I was reading. Yeah, I'd get the general idea, but I didn't really get the core of it until I like read it with professors that like knew what the hell he really meant, so I could like spit you a quote and think that I knew what the hell I was talking about, and I didn't. So it's really tricky, but I would definitely suggest starting with, there's a 2-page essay, and it's online for free. You can find it pretty much anywhere, called Thesis on Feuerbach, Feuerbach. And it's like just like literally 2 pages long, really short. And then I would go with the economic philosophic manuscripts. So there, he's like talking about stuff in a way more practical way. One of the problems I think is that a lot of professors, one, either go to Communist Manifesto or start with Capital. And Capital, I mean, I think people should read Capital, but that's like 3 1,000-page books, and it's like his mature work, which means that like a lot of the words he's using and the terms he's using, he's presupposing, right, from all of his earlier literature. Another way of also, reading it on your own, but having some sort of assistance with it, really lectures on YouTube. There's a lot of really good Marxian economists and Marxian philosophers that like do lectures and stuff for, you can just like go to YouTube and watch something. Like there's one specifically who I really like, not because I necessarily agree with everything he says, but because he's super practical. In other words, he's not there just talking shit. He gives like practical applications of this. His name's Richard Wolff with 2 Fs. And if you would just like, I don't know, type in Richard Wolff Marxian economics on like a YouTube search, that would all pop up. And there'd be like endless lectures you could listen to. And those are really good typically. Anything else? No? Well, thank you, everyone.